Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to crisis management, business continuity, COVID, wellness, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Longtime listeners and viewers will know that I was speaking at the BCI World Virtual Conference in 2021 in the fall. And my hope was maybe I could get a couple of the speakers to come on the show and talk about their topic or a related topic. Today is one of those days where I'm lucky enough to get one of those speakers. In fact, he's the author of Crisis Proof: How to Prepare for the Worst Day of Your Business Life. Yikes. I'd like to welcome to the show author and expert, crisis management expert, Jonathan Hemus. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm really pleased to be here.
As I mentioned your book, it happened to come 2 days ago. So even though I ordered it longer than that, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to read the book, but I have your presentation. I'm looking forward to the book and reading, and congratulations on it as well.
Thank you.
Now, we've shared emails back and forth. I know who you are and what you've done, but could you take a moment to tell our global listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself, what you do, and also how you got into this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the managing director of a specialist crisis management consultancy called Insignia. We work with leaders of businesses around the world to help them plan, train, rehearse, and sometimes handle the worst days of their business lives. And we do that through developing crisis management plans, training crisis management team members, running exercises of all kinds, and as I mentioned, also advising during crisis situations. And we operate right across the sectors, financial services companies, airlines, Cathay Pacific, for example, retailers, Lidl, which is one of the biggest supermarket groups in Europe, through to mining. We work for Anglo American and media. Sky is a client, for example. And I think, like most people doing jobs like mine, when I was at university or a teenager, I never imagined that I would end up as a crisis management consultant, which I've been doing now for 25 years. I guess I didn't even know what a crisis management consultant was at that stage. But really, I mean, the short answer to your question as to how I got here is that I was always interested, or certainly from teenage years onwards, in business, in communication, and in people. And I think crisis management is a situation where those three things very much come together. So my early career was in corporate communication, working in-house at a quoted company, communicating about acquisitions and also problems and issues that the organization faced from time to time. Moved into corporate communication consultancy, and about 25 years ago was asked to become head of the global crisis and issues management practice at a firm called Porter Novelli, a global consultancy. And that was a fantastic opportunity because in my preceding years, I had very much learned that the bit of communication that I loved the most was when times are challenging. It's when communication really matters. Set Insignia up 13 years ago because it's great being in a big consultancy, but I really wanted to specialize in my area of passion because, you know, I've seen how many organizations have suffered as a result of a mishandled crisis, but just as painful and kind of annoying to me is not just the damage they do to themselves, but also to their stakeholders. So my mission now really is to help businesses and their leaders to avoid the needless damage that can be caused by a mishandled crisis. And that was also the motivation for writing the book. So that's me, Alex.
Oh, well, welcome to the show. And you know, after all of that, I'm surprised you found time to be able to write a book.
Well, there was a little bit more time last year than I'd anticipated, because as you can imagine, many people, rather than training for a crisis or rehearsing their crisis response, were actively in crisis mode. So whilst we were extremely busy on the consultancy side, it did create a little bit more time to write the book that I'd always planned doing, but of course had never got round to. So they say out of crisis comes opportunity, and for me, that was the one opportunity that came last year that I'm really pleased I grabbed.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it. And same thing occurred to me. All of a sudden, I had time and I wrote and published a book as well. So it's interesting. And I interviewed someone the other day who did the same thing. So I guess a lot of us now have some time to
Yes,
get some pull some ideas out of our head.
absolutely.
Let's jump into your talk from the BCI World Conference. And that was entitled How to Guide Leaders Through the Worst Days of Their Business Lives. And you start off by talking about the challenging risk landscape. Can you tell us about what you were talking about there?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I touched on it just a couple of seconds ago, that out of crisis comes opportunity. And for people that work in crisis management and business continuity, clearly none of us would have wanted last year and what's continuing to have happened. But one of the things that it did do was brought to the attention of leaders of businesses who before had never had to endure a crisis, thankfully, the importance of being prepared for them, because there were organizations that responded to last year's extraordinary challenges really well, and there were those that maybe hadn't planned and prepared and struggled even more than those who had put the time in beforehand to developing good crisis management plans. So I guess, you know, that very much brought crisis management into the forefront of leaders' attention. And I guess I can only say, sadly, you know, 2021 has brought an even more challenging risk landscape, because clearly the pandemic has continued. But we also have other challenges as business leaders. So we know the environment is very much on the agenda at the moment, and environmental activism and pressure is absolutely on the rise. So for organizations that may have an environmental impact, that is definitely a rising issue. We know that there are technological risks, and in particular, cyber incidents, cyber attacks. That clearly has been a growing risk for the last decade, and in particular over the last 3 to 5 years. Sadly, the cyber criminals, you know, took advantage of the pandemic and, you know, recognized that people might be more vulnerable when they were working from home, didn't have the same corporate security around them, might actually be less minded to flag the fact that they may have clicked on a wrong link. And also, again, and this is horrible, the way that criminals' minds work, but you know, the ability to send phishing emails supposedly from banks helping people at a time when they're struggling financially, or supposedly from health departments or healthcare providers asking you to click on a link. You know, the pandemic provided opportunities. So technological risk is another big one, particularly cybercrime. And we also know that reputational risk is on the increase. You know, behavioral issues, cultural issues, the way that ethics play out in organizations, that is also on the increase. So crisis management and business continuity professionals have been, I think it's fair to say, fully employed over the last 18 to 24 months. And whether we view it as problem, challenge, or opportunity, I certainly see that continuing for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't look like the things are going to end anytime soon. Interesting, you talked about the phishing emails and things like that. I noticed an increase in my own inbox. And a couple of times I've actually been caught because they were real, real
Yes.
emails that I just kind of went, no, I'm not quite sure about that, delete. And then someone calls a week later, did you ever get that notice? I need
Yeah.
it. Like, oh, sorry. I thought it was
Well,
phishing.
that's true, but much better that way round than the other.
Yeah, the alternative could be, devastating.
Yeah.
With crisis management and some of the things that are occurring, what are some of the pressures that leadership and organizations are under? What kind of things are they facing when faced with all of this?
Yeah, and this is one of the things that fascinated me and to an extent baffled me when I first got into crisis management more than 20 years ago. The fact that, really successful businesses, much of my businesses led by very experienced business people, seem to do irrational and counterproductive things when faced with a crisis. Mine is not the first crisis management textbook to be written. So why haven't, some of the lessons from the previous textbooks and experience been applied? And, now that I've been in this area for 20 years or more, I think I know some of the answers. And the first one is literally that the organization is facing, and the leaders of the organization are facing, an extraordinary challenge. This is not business as usual. And a crisis brings with it unique factors which can cause leaders to do irrational things. So there's uncertainty. Crises always bring uncertainty. There's speculation. We don't quite know what's going on. We certainly don't know what's going to happen next. So we don't have the facts. We don't have full visibility. Everything is very fluid and dynamic. Secondly, time pressure. We can all make good decisions if we have a week or a month or 3 months to evaluate everything and consider all the pros and cons and then make a decision. In a crisis, you may be required to make decisions certainly within hours, sometimes within minutes, with incomplete information and with very, very high stakes. What we know is that organizations that get their crisis response wrong suffer significant consequences. Likewise, the individuals that lead those businesses suffer significant consequences in terms of losing their job or all sorts of other negative outcomes. So there's a real kind of emotional pressure going on there, which causes adrenaline to flow and the amygdala in the brain to start flashing. And then you combine that with kind of the more rational reasons why maybe organizations don't always succeed in a crisis. It can be as simple as they haven't developed their crisis management plan, or maybe the people required to deploy that plan haven't been trained, or they haven't found the time to rehearse their response. And put those two things together, you're under extraordinary pressure, you've got high stakes, lack of information, lack of time, and you've never actually worked out how you're going to operate in a crisis. And all of a sudden it becomes less surprising that leaders sometimes fail to follow the golden rules of crisis management. And for me, the rehearsal bit is really, really important. I always say, I'm a sports fan. If we think about football, soccer,
who's your team?
My team is Aston Villa. So we have a relatively recent new manager in the form of Steven Gerrard, ex of Liverpool.
Steven Gerrard is okay, but Aston Villa, I don't know. Maybe we should end this interview. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm just kidding. Alex. Let's be friends.
I'm just kidding. You mentioned something before you go too far that I thought, as you were talking about leadership, and the timing and the need of them. Is there, it got me thinking, is there a gap in our training of these leaders? Because they go to university, college, or all these training courses to learn how to keep the bottom line flowing, shall we say, right? And hopefully delegate work and everybody work to a common goal and vision.
Yeah.
Yet there doesn't seem to be anything about crisis management training if something goes wrong. It seems to be that that's left up to either a crisis management person or a business continuity person to train the leader on how to do this. So is there a gap somewhere here? It sure feels like it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And it's actually another of my personal passions that, in fact, I'm a visiting lecturer at Aston University Business School, which is one of the top business schools in the UK, and lecture on their MBA course because of exactly what you have described. Crisis management skills, unless you're a very careless organization, are not required every day of the year.
Mm-hmm.
But when they are required, boy, are they required. And the way that leaders operate during business as usual do not work in a crisis. And I think, particularly for senior leaders, you're not going to have a crisis, as I say, every week, but you probably will have several, if not more than several, major incidents during a career. And those are defining moments, both within your career and in the history of the organization which you are leading or part of the management team of. And so I absolutely believe that the skills required in crisis management should be essential parts of the curriculum for all aspiring leaders. And the other reason why I think it kind of makes sense, even if you never have, fortunate enough never to endure a crisis, actually the skills that you learn in crisis can be applied to business as usual at a very simple level. One of the requirements, this is a real practical example, but in a crisis, you must have really well structured, really purposeful, really effective meetings where you get the best out of your team, but you don't allow the meeting to drift and you reach decisions and actions quickly. Well, wouldn't that be quite useful in business as usual? How many times have we sat in rambling, meandering meetings when it's not quite sure by the end of 2.5 hours what we've decided? So that's just one very practical example, but there are many others whereby, as I say, even if you never endure a crisis, the skills that are relevant in a crisis are absolutely relevant in business as usual, but not necessarily the other way around.
Yeah, because I've noticed that, especially ever since I've been doing Voice America and the YouTube channel and talking to so many people, that there's a push for business continuity people, crisis management people, emergency managers. You can go on down the line with different groups here. Make sure you're training your executives. Okay, the executives aren't getting trained on crisis management in their curriculum, as you say.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of these other people aren't being trained on how to train either. They're just being told to train these other people. So it feels like we've got students teaching students.
Yes.
And no real proper way to train people. Here's how you deal with executives, and how to what they're looking for to make that better, right? That whole piece seems to be really wishy-washy and all over the place.
No, I agree. And that was one of the biggest, if not the biggest motivation actually for writing the book, because what I'd recognized when working with our clients is that often responsibility for crisis management within an organization actually is given to someone who may not themselves necessarily have been trained in crisis management, and yet they're given this really kind of exciting but also important responsibility and expected to lead that function within the organization. And they've probably, by the way, also got a day job. As you've said, some of them may be business continuity professionals, but some of the people given responsibility for crisis management might be heads of communication or head of health and safety or head of risk or head of security. And so actually, and the book is certainly not the total solution, but the book is aimed at people like that to give them a framework and the knowledge to be able to fulfill that role successfully. But the other bit you mentioned, it's also critical to engage with the leaders of the business, because ultimately the professionals within the business, they can advise, they can lead, they can support, but it's the leaders who will make those critical decisions that determine the fate of the organization and its stakeholders when the worst occurs.
Well, let's talk about leaders a little bit more. How do you get their buy-in on some of this?
Yeah, it can be a challenge. I mean, there are organizations and there are leaders where the leader simply gets it, and that is the ideal situation. And I think, all of the really successful and most admired leaders in a crisis, it comes from within. They recognize the importance of committing to planning, training, rehearsal, and they step forward when the crisis happens, and they lead in a way which is empathetic, which focuses on the human side of the crisis, which looks at it from the outside in, and they also lead from the front. And it's a joy when you have a leader or a leadership team that fulfills that criteria. That isn't always the case, and so sometimes it is about persuasion, lobbying, influence, building a case. And I guess one of the critical factors and one of the keys to success, I think, is getting your timing right. So in other words, if your organization has just had a near miss or a minor incident, that can be a good time for having that discussion around, well, what about if that had got worse? Might it not be an idea to have a look at the plans if we've got them, or develop a plan if we don't? Let's rehearse, a response to this situation that actually got worse. Another example, which I've seen kind of happen on many occasions during my career, is jumping on competitor crises and using that as a catalyst. I recall, here in the UK, when we had the horse meat scandal, where burgers and such like were full of horse rather than beef, the amount of food companies that came to us wanting to have their plans audited, wanting to rehearse, because they'd seen it happening to competitors, not actually to them, but all of a sudden that could be us. So I would be very much looking out for competitor incidents and taking those to your leadership team. And I found that really works, because leaders very much empathize and can recognize that if it can happen to them, it can happen to us. And third thing, I talked about the different functions that kind of look after crisis management within businesses. I think sometimes those functions can be siloed, and I think there's a real opportunity for the health and safety folk, the business continuity folk, the communications people, the risk people, the cybersecurity people, to come together and to jointly lobby their colleagues and leaders. Don't do it as individuals. Build a coalition, and I think that can be really, really powerful too.
It's good to hear you mention all those different groups working together, because I've been saying that for 20 years.
Yeah.
Can't work in silos, and I'm mostly business continuity, so I'll that industry. I can't do business continuity properly without health and safety, without crisis management, communications, without all these other groups. I need their input. We have to work together to make it work. So I'm really happy to hear you say that.
Yeah.
On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. Today, we are talking with Jonathan Hemus, speaker at BCI World Virtual 2021 and author of Crisis Proof. And we will be right back. Welcome back. Today, we are talking with Jonathan Hemus, author of Crisis Proof. Jonathan, lots of great information in the first segment, and I really enjoyed our chat about the training piece there. I'm really happy to hear what you had to say there about the gaps. But let's move on now to what do organizations need to have in place pre-crisis, where things may seem like bunnies and rainbows, but they're not going to last. So what should they have in place?
Yeah, I mean, my strong view, and indeed my experience and all the evidence I've seen, says that it's not having a crisis that necessarily causes damage to an organization. It's how they respond to the crisis that has the power to cause damage. And what I've also experienced is that, therefore, it is what you do before the crisis that will determine how you respond to a crisis situation. So, I touched on sport before the break. For me, not preparing for a crisis is a bit like a football team about to play in the World Cup final, the biggest match in the world, with high stakes, great pressure, once in a lifetime opportunity or challenge, and not bothering doing any training or thinking about tactics or who's going to play what role in the team. It just wouldn't happen. But a crisis is like the kind of anti-World Cup final. It's the biggest day in the life of that organization and its leaders. And yet some organizations seem to think that it's okay to go into that biggest day without ever having planned, trained, or rehearsed. So I think it makes a massive difference to the outcome what you do before the crisis. So in simple terms, it is about planning, in other words, developing an effective crisis management plan. Now, a couple of words on what I believe an effective crisis management plan is. For me, a crisis management plan can never be an answer to every question or every challenge that you may be confronted with in a crisis. What it should be is a structured, purposeful way of working, supported by checklists and materials and prompts and processes that facilitate a purposeful, effective way of working, whatever crisis you may be facing. Ideally, it should also be supplemented with risk-specific checklists against your key risks. But what I really want to strongly counsel against is a pure playbook approach, which has multiple risks covered off, but that is all that it contains. Because if you limit yourself to very detailed checklists against your 10 top risks, then of course, the danger is that the 11th, 12th, or 131st risk occurs, and your beautifully crafted plan, which suits the first 10, does not suit the one that's emerged. So please make sure that the plan, the core plan, can be deployed whatever the crisis is. So that's the first thing that organizations need to do before a crisis. The second thing is they need to make sure that the people who will be required to be part of a crisis management team know what they need to do. So a crisis management plan has little more than zero value if the people required to deploy it haven't been briefed on it and haven't been trained on what they would need to do. So it is essential that the people on the team, A, are briefed on the plan. What does it contain? Give them an understanding of it, an initial walkthrough, and B, then are trained on the particular role or roles they might be required to play. And it can be really what sounds like a simple role. Let's take the log keeper. Well, anybody can write on a whiteboard or, an online flip chart, can't they? Well, yes, but if you then imagine that you're having to do that in a situation where, again, emotions are running high, the leadership team is in discussion or debate, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of emotion, they're maybe not making the crispest decisions, that is not an easy job to do. Therefore, the person playing that role needs to be given training, not just on how to write on the board, but how to make sure that the team is giving to them what they need to put onto that board. So training is the second thing. The third thing is rehearsal. And for me, real crisis preparedness only occurs when the team has rehearsed its response and has rehearsed it on multiple occasions, because on the first occasion they rehearse, they will do well if they score 6 or 7 out of 10 because they've not done it before. But from 6 or 7 out of 10, the next time you do it, it's going to be 8 or 9 out of 10. But it's only by experiencing what a crisis feels like, by getting the opportunity to make decisions under pressure and deploy your plan in a realistic scenario-based exercise, that you gear yourself up for the real thing. So in brief, those are the 3 things that need to be in place to give you confidence that the organization will respond well when the worst occurs.
Now you've got me wondering who needs to be a part of this crisis team, because we've obviously talked about leadership.
Yeah.
Then we've talked about other people that are putting the plan together. You've mentioned a scribe. But, who really needs to be a part of this crisis management team?
So we would tend to advise having crisis management specific roles represented on the team. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me give you a few examples. So clearly you need a chair or a team leader. That person does not have to be the most senior person in the organization. It needs to be someone who commands the respect of that team. They must be senior, but they don't have to be the most senior person. They will typically be the person chairing the meetings and making the big calls. The reason why it doesn't have to be the CEO or the most senior person is because actually by taking the CEO out of that role, you can free them up to do other things. Actually running the team meetings might not be the best thing for the CEO to be doing. They still will need to make the big calls, but actually running the meetings, if you've got a great COO or another person who just has that respect and that ability to manage that team, they may be the right person to do it. The second critical role is what we would typically call the crisis coordinator. So that probably is the most senior person, or the person who's responsible for crisis management within the organization. It could be the business continuity person, the resilience person. Their role is to make sure that the team follows the plan and the ways of working that have been determined beforehand, because the chair will not be as immersed in how the plan is supposed to play out as the crisis coordinator. So they are the kind of voice of truth, the voice of reason, the right-hand person for the team leader to make sure that the process is being followed and to make sure that the resources that the team has at their disposal are brought to their attention. Talked about the scribe. I'll talk about one more role and then briefly subject matter experts. The information lead is one that we recommend having as a team. They are the person responsible for making sure that information is appropriately filtered and verified and then fed into the team. If you have multiple channels of communication into multiple people on the team, you end up with different people on the team having different levels of information, people having information which may not actually be correct, and that leads to very muddied and confused decision making. Final part, and there are other roles, but you would then bring onto the team subject matter experts relevant to that particular situation. So to take the obvious example, in a cyber crisis, you would want the CISO as part of that team. You would want technical representation. And I guess I would also say that in almost all crisis situations, almost without exception, you would want legal, communication, and HR represented. Final point, Alex, on this question. The principle, though, for your crisis management team is as small as possible while still having the right expertise in the room. If you're starting to get into double figures, that can be slightly unwieldy in terms of actually getting to a decision. And you want all of those people in the room. Wouldn't some of them be better off outside of the room and doing stuff rather than talking about stuff?
Yeah, like that expression, too many cooks spoil the
Off.
food, the dinner, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you create a crisis resilient culture within an organization?
Yeah, I talked about pre-crisis. Actually, even more important than the things I talked about is having a crisis resistant culture. And again, ultimately, that is driven by the leadership team of the organization. The example that they set, the fact that the chief executive is the first one through the door when we're running the annual exercise, for example, that makes a really big difference. But what are some of the behaviors that we would observe within that crisis resistant culture that they have created? Well, the first is a willingness for the organization to recognize that bad things can happen to them. I was talking with a client last week, and clearly I won't name them, but they were very reticent to believe that any of their leadership could engage in inappropriate behavior. But they were willing to believe that competitors' leadership team could engage in inappropriate behavior. Now, no one was saying that their leadership team was engaging in inappropriate behavior, but to believe that it is impossible for a member of a leadership team within my organization to believe it's impossible that they would engage in inappropriate behavior, and therefore we will not contemplate that kind of a risk within our organization, is flawed in my view. I'm not suggesting that this organization or others are bad organizations, but what I am suggesting is you have to be open to the possibility of something bad happening within your organization. And if you're not, you are creating the potential for crisis and the potential not to be ready for certain crisis types.
And it doesn't mean that's intentional bad behavior.
No.
Down to just simply the wrong training again, right?
Absolutely. And the kind of conundrum here, the kind of catch-22 situation almost, is that for the very best organizations, the ones whose quality standards and other policies, procedures and behaviors actually are of a very high standard, they are the ones that find it hardest to countenance that something bad could happen. But because they have such high standards and probably such a good reputation, they would also be the ones who are most vulnerable if something bad does happen. So it's not about saying or suggesting you are a bad organization. It's just about saying, however good you are, you cannot rule out the possibility of something negative happening. But you're right, Alex, it's not they're seeking to cover up, or they just can't conceive of it. Right. Second and critical element of a crisis resistant culture is a willingness by leadership to hear bad news and then to act on it. We've heard a lot over the last couple of years about whistleblowers who've been ignored, issues which have been brought to leaders' attention but then not acted on. And what ultimately happens in those kinds of situations is people stop flagging bad news, and so the leaders never get to hear about it. The best kind of crisis management is crisis prevention, and you only get that if you get to learn about minor issues and incidents early on before they escalate into crisis. So that's really, really important. And a willingness to learn from near misses. We talked about this earlier on, but not allowing a near miss to pass without taking the learnings out of it. That creates a crisis resistant culture, by taking time to learn. And final thing I'd mention is, be careful about how people are incentivized. To take, a very kind of crude and obvious example, if people are simply, for example, incentivized on how many widgets they get out of the factory and that's it, therefore they are incentivized to do things faster, quicker, What might be the consequence of that? Well, health and safety might be the consequence of that. So
Mhm.
just leaders need to be careful about how people are rewarded and incentivized. And, there are a number of crises over the years whereby, a focus on commercial metrics may have contributed to catastrophic crises.
Well, let's look at that a little bit further. What are some of the common flaws in crisis management and crisis response?
Yeah, there are a number of flaws, again, that I've observed over the years, and they play out time and time again. So it's about understanding and recognizing them beforehand so that we can not make them or catch ourselves making them when the crisis happens. So I guess one of the most common flaws is delaying decision making until it is too late. So because of, again, the pressure and the situation that organizations and organizational leaders find themselves in, they will constantly be seeking to reduce the uncertainty by getting more and more information to inform their decisions before committing to a decision. The problem is, what I've seen is they're always looking, so they get the piece of information that they wanted, but they then want the next piece of information and the one after that and the one after that, therefore delaying decision making until it's almost too late or irrelevant. So good crisis management is about being courageous in decision making. Yes, absolutely, gathering and analyzing as much information as you can, but then at a certain point making that decision. And every decision in a crisis will bring with it potential downsides, but that's what leadership is about. It's about making the best decision you can with the information that you have at that moment in time. So that would be one of the most common flaws. Another very common flaw in crisis response is fundamentally people acting without thinking. Again, a lot of it comes down to the pressure, and it comes down to people's tendency to be fixers. So people doing lots of things, but not necessarily doing the right things.
What kind of things? Are we talking people that just kind of rush in and want to fix everything but get nothing accomplished, or people that just really aren't supposed to be involved, getting involved and getting in the way and causing problems?
Yeah, let me characterize it in a couple of different ways. So let me think about, first of all, the most senior person in the business. Let's say it is the CEO. What we will often see is, because we are all, but I think CEOs in particular, are problem solvers and fixers. Let's say there's been a cyber attack. They will jump to the detail of what has happened and start to be thinking or suggesting how to fix that, rather than leading the organization and leading the response. So you will get very senior people, but also all members of the team wanting to do things. Now, if I flip that round and say, well, what does good look like if people acting without thinking is bad? Well, what you really need to know in a crisis is, what are we actually seeking to achieve here? So we call it strategic intent. At the start of a crisis, a strategic intent needs to be defined. In other words, what does success look like? What are we actually seeking to achieve through our crisis management? Immediately, we then align everybody in the team around the same end goal. The second thing that teams should be doing is saying, what is our main effort now? Main effort means, what are the priorities right now to fix? So if you have strategic intent, the end goal, a main effort, the priorities, that enables the actions that people take to fit within those two headings, rather than somewhat ad hoc or random actions which are not organized under clear thought.
We've only got 3 minutes left, but I wanted to touch on this because this isn't far from where I live. It is a quote from Michael McCain,
Yeah.
CEO of Canadian food manufacturer Maple Leaf Foods, which is huge here in Canada.
Yeah.
I want to read his quote, and then I just want to hear what you have to say about this. Going through the crisis, there are two advisors I've paid no attention to. The first are the lawyers, and the second are the accountants. It's not about money or legal liability. This is about our being accountable for providing customers with safe food.
So Michael McCain, I believe, in the year the incident occurred, won Business Person of the Year in Canada. And for me, what he said there and everything I've read about the case, he epitomizes the perfect crisis leader, because in very simple terms, he says and does the right things. And what that quote epitomizes is they responded to that situation in a way which was absolutely in keeping with the values of the organization and what they promised beforehand. I think his tongue was slightly in his cheek when he said he didn't listen to the lawyers or the accountants at all. My view is leaders should listen to their advisors, but they should not follow their advisors. They listen and then they decide and they do what they believe is right. And that's exactly what Michael McCain did. And I would completely and utterly endorse his quote. And indeed, it's one that I use in presentations and with clients all of the time. So you have a great crisis leader there in Canada, Alex.
Yes. And for anyone who doesn't know, in Canada, I guess this is what, 14, 15 years ago, there was a listeria outbreak in a maple leaf food production plant, and about 21 people, I think it was, died as a result. And I can say, and maybe, I don't know if you know this actually, Jonathan, but he was on radio doing radio commercials, and he was also on television. And there were network television commercials where he sat on his desk and said, I take responsibility for this, and I'm not backing away until everything is taken care of. When court cases came out, he didn't push back on them at all. He just took complete accountability and responsibility, and they built back because of it.
Well, that's the bottom line. He retained the trust and confidence of his customers and other stakeholders. It was, I'm sure, painful at the time. I'm sure it cost at the time, but he knew it was the right thing to do. But it was also the right thing for the long-term commercial viability of the organization.
Well, we've come to the show. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise and time. And congratulations on the book, Crisis Proof. I'm looking forward to reading this. I wish it had come a week earlier so that I could have read it before our talk today. But thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. I really enjoyed our chat today. I've quite enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Alex. I have enjoyed it too.
Great. You have a great day. Have a great holiday season, because we are recording just before the holidays. So have a fantastic holiday season, and all the best to you and yours. And to everybody listening and watching, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.